Imagine you lose a fight. You lose badly. Your house gets shelled. Your generals get killed. Your bank accounts get frozen by the person who just finished beating you. And a few weeks later, once the smoke clears and the cameras leave, you send that same person an invoice. Not a demand for reparations, not a symbolic gesture. An actual invoice, itemized, with a line for tolls and a line for administrative fees for the privilege of using a road that runs past your house. That is, roughly speaking, what Iran did this week. And the fact that it sounds almost too brazen to be true is exactly why you need to understand how it happened, because it did not happen by accident. It happened because Iran identified, with a precision that should worry anyone who thinks this war ended in February, the one asset it never lost. Let's talk about it. On July 2nd, sources told NBC News that Iran and Oman had jointly presented the United States with a formal proposal to administer the Strait of Hormuz going forward, one that includes the joint collection of administrative fees from ships transiting the strait. Not a threat, not a warning shot fired at a cargo vessel, the way we saw a few weeks ago with the Ever Lovely. A proposal, a document, something you negotiate over a table with lawyers present, the way two sovereign administrators of a shared asset would negotiate a lease. The Trump administration's public position, delivered by a White House spokesperson, was immediate and unambiguous. Iran cannot toll the strait because it is an international waterway, and international waterways cannot be tolled by any single country. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said essentially the same thing to reporters in the Gulf last week, before this proposal had even formally landed. No country is allowed to charge fees on an international strait. That is existing international law, and that is the way it works everywhere in the world. Firm, clean, legally coherent. And yet, at the very same moment that Washington was saying this publicly, American and Iranian negotiators were sitting in Doha in indirect talks mediated by Qatar, working through exactly this question, among others, as part of the 60-day window that both countries agreed to back in June. Axios reported that the American envoys in that room, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, were not simply repeating the White House line and walking out. They were trying to talk Iran out of the tolls, which is a very different verb than refusing. You do not need to talk someone out of something you consider illegal and impossible. You talk someone out of something you are worried they might actually be able to do. This is the contradiction I want you to sit with for the next 35 minutes, because everything interesting about this moment lives inside it. In public, the American position is, this is not negotiable. This is settled law. Full stop. In private, in the room where the actual decisions get made, the American position is, please don't do this. What would it take for you not to do this? Those are not the same posture. And when a government's public rhetoric and its private conduct diverge that sharply, the private conduct is almost always the more honest signal, because rhetoric is cheap and negotiating position is not. So let's ask the obvious question. How did we get here? How does a country that just had its supreme leader killed, its nuclear program bombed, its senior military and clerical leadership decapitated in a strike explicitly designed to break its capacity to resist, end up 4 months later with enough leverage to propose a toll booth on one of the most important pieces of economic infrastructure on the planet, and have the world's most powerful country quietly, carefully, try to talk it out of that instead of simply overruling it? The answer is geography. And it is worth being precise about the geography because the precision is the whole story. The Strait of Hormuz is roughly 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, with the actual navigable shipping channels narrower still, split into inbound and outbound lanes separated by a buffer zone. Through that gap passes something in the range of a fifth of the world's oil and a comparable share of the world's liquefied natural gas. Saudi Arabia's export economy depends on it. The UAE's does. Qatar's LNG trade, which heats homes across Europe and Asia, depends on it entirely. Iran sits on the northern shore. Oman sits on the southern shore at the tip of the Musandam Peninsula. Every other country that benefits from the strait, every country that built an economy assuming this water would stay open and free, is simply downstream of a fact of physical geography they do not control and never did. For 70 years, this fact did not matter, because American naval power made it not matter. The Fifth Fleet, based in Bahrain, existed for exactly this purpose, to guarantee that geography would never translate into leverage. Iran could grumble about sovereignty over its territorial waters, and it did for decades. But grumbling is not enforcement, and everyone in the region knew the difference. What the war earlier this year did, whatever else it did, whatever the strategic costs and the human costs, and they were enormous, is it forced a live test of the assumption that American naval power made the geography irrelevant, and the assumption failed the test. Iran closed the strait, not symbolically. Actually, tanker traffic dropped to almost nothing within days. 20,000 mariners and 2,000 ships were reported stranded in the Gulf by the International Maritime Organization at the height of it. Insurance premiums on strait transits spiked by a factor of 3 before the war even started, on the mere expectation of what was coming. And when the ceasefire finally arrived, when Trump and Iran's president signed their memorandum of understanding at Versailles on June 17th, the document did not say the strait belongs to everyone, full stop, forever, the way American officials would have wanted it to. It said in Article 5 that Iran and Oman would discuss the future management of navigation. That sentence, that single deliberately vague sentence, is the reason we're here today, because discuss the future management can mean whatever the party with the most leverage wants it to mean once the discussing actually starts. And Iran walked into that discussion holding cards it did not hold in February. Now let's talk about why this is a toll proposal and not a closure threat, because that shift matters more than it might first appear. And this is where I want to bring in a framework that I think explains the entire logic of what's happening far better than any amount of day-to-day news coverage does. Economists have a very old, very simple concept for this kind of situation. It's called economic rent, specifically the rent that accrues to whoever controls a natural choke point. Not rent in the sense of a monthly apartment payment. Rent in the older technical sense, income you receive not because you produce something of value, but because you happen to control access to something everyone else needs and cannot get around. The classic textbook example is a toll bridge over a river with no other crossing for 100 miles in either direction. The bridge owner did not build the river. The bridge owner did not create the demand for crossing it. The bridge owner simply owns the one point where geography forces everyone else to pay them. The Suez Canal charges tolls and nobody blinks because Egypt built the canal, dug it, maintains it, dredges it, and the toll is understood internationally as payment for a constructed and maintained piece of infrastructure. The Panama Canal is the same story. Those are legitimate service fees for artificial infrastructure that would not exist without continuous investment. The Strait of Hormuz is not a canal. Nobody built it. Nobody maintains it in the way Egypt maintains Suez. It is simply water, shaped by geology millions of years before any nation-state existed, that happens to sit 21 nautical miles from Iranian shore to Omani shore at its pinch point, which is exactly why the entire international legal architecture around straits, specifically the transit passage regime under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, exists to draw a hard line between a coastal state's right to regulate traffic near its shores and a coastal state's right to extract payment for the mere existence of that traffic. Regulation, yes. Notification requirements, yes. Traffic separation schemes, yes. Iran and Oman can absolutely set those up. Tolls, historically, unambiguously, no. That right has never been recognized for a natural international strait, precisely because recognizing it would hand every country lucky enough to sit next to a choke point the power to tax global trade indefinitely, forever, for doing nothing except existing in the right place on a map. So when Oman's foreign minister said this week that his government does not support mandatory tolls, but drew a careful distinction toward what he called voluntary charges, similar to models used elsewhere, and when an unnamed Gulf official told reporters, and I want you to actually hear the language here, maybe now time is suitable to charge something. What you are watching is not a legal argument. Nobody in that room actually believes tolling a natural strait is settled, permissible international practice. What you are watching is a live negotiation over how much of a rent extraction the world will tolerate, dressed up in the vocabulary of maintenance fees and voluntary contributions and administrative costs, because the vocabulary of legitimate infrastructure fees is simply more palatable at a negotiating table than the vocabulary of a choke point tax. Iran does not need the world to agree that this is legal. Iran needs the world to agree to pay it anyway, under a label everyone can live with. That is a much lower bar to clear, and it is the bar Tehran is actually aiming for. This is where the free rider logic that shapes so much of the current geopolitical landscape flips completely on its head, and I think this reversal is genuinely the most interesting part of this story. In the usual version of this problem, the one you hear about constantly regarding NATO and European defense spending, the free rider is the weaker party, sheltering under someone else's security guarantee, contributing less than its fair share, while the stronger party foots the bill. Iran, in this story, is not free riding on anyone. Iran is doing something structurally different and in some ways more audacious. Iran fought a war it lost by every conventional military metric, its nuclear infrastructure damaged, its supreme leader killed, its senior leadership decimated, and it is now trying to convert the one piece of leverage that survived the war, pure accident of geography leverage, into a permanent, self-renewing revenue stream, paid indefinitely by the very countries that just finished bombing it. If this works, even partially, even in the diluted, voluntary contribution form that Oman is floating, Iran will have accomplished something no amount of battlefield success could have delivered: a recurring income stream funded by the international shipping industry that exists independent of oil sanctions, independent of frozen asset negotiations, independent of whatever happens with the nuclear file. You cannot sanction a toll. You cannot freeze a transit fee in a Belgian clearinghouse the way you can freeze a sovereign wealth account. If ships are paying as they pass, the money moves in real time, ship by ship, day by day, and by the time anyone in Washington or Brussels wants to object to a specific payment, it has already been collected. Now, let's talk about the American side of this. Because the contradiction between the public refusal and the private negotiation tells you something important about the actual balance of power here, and it is not the story the White House statement wants you to believe. Rubio's position that no country may toll an international waterway, that this is settled law, is legally correct as a matter of the text of customary international law. But being legally correct and being enforceable are two entirely different things, and the last 4 months have been an extended, expensive lesson in exactly that distinction. The United States tried air power against Iran for roughly 40 days according to the sequence of events, and it did not produce Iranian capitulation. It tried a naval blockade for close to 2 months, and that did not produce it either. What eventually produced a ceasefire was economic exhaustion working in both directions simultaneously, oil prices climbing, global shipping insurance markets seizing up, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve reportedly approaching a level that made sustained military operations in the Gulf harder to justify, and enough domestic political pressure in Washington from an angry, inflation-weary public that the administration needed an exit. Given that sequence, given that neither air power nor naval power nor economic pressure produced the outcome Washington originally wanted, what exactly is the enforcement mechanism behind Rubio's statement that Iran, quote, cannot toll the strait? Say it plainly, out loud, so you hear how it sounds. Cannot, according to whom, backed by what? If the answer is another blockade, the oil markets already know what that costs, and they priced it in earlier this year. If the answer is another round of airstrikes, that reopens a war that both sides just spent considerable political capital ending over a fee schedule, which is a genuinely difficult thing to sell to war-weary electorates in a democracy. Which is exactly why the real conversation is happening in Doha and not in a Pentagon briefing room, and exactly why Witkoff and Kushner are reportedly negotiating the shape of the arrangement rather than simply declaring it void. I also want to flag something happening inside Iran right now that makes this negotiation even more unstable than it already sounds, because it is not just Iran versus America at that table. It is also Iran versus itself. The talks in Doha were paused this week for the funeral of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, killed in the February strikes, a funeral being staged deliberately as a display of regime continuity with foreign dignitaries from Pakistan, China, and India in attendance, precisely to signal to the world, and frankly to the Israeli and American intelligence services that engineered his death, that the state survived the decapitation intact. His son, Mojtaba, is stepping into the role of supreme leader, and there is real uncertainty inside Iran's political establishment right now about how hardline his posture will be relative to the more pragmatic camp around President Pezeshkian, the camp that actually wants sanctions relief and frozen assets unlocked and is willing to trade toward that outcome. The toll proposal is popular with the harder-line factions precisely because it does not require American goodwill to function. Sanctions relief requires Washington to agree to release money. A toll requires nothing from Washington except ships continuing to sail, which they will, because the alternative to paying a toll is not sailing at all, and no shipping company, no insurer, no government dependent on that oil-reaching market is prepared to accept that alternative. In other words, the toll proposal is, functionally, a hedge against the possibility that the broader nuclear negotiation collapses. Even if Pezeshkian's diplomatic track fails entirely, even if the frozen billions never get released, Iran will still have a strait, and a strait, once you've demonstrated you're willing to use it, does not need Washington's permission to start generating income. So where does this actually go? I think there are three plausible paths, and I want to walk through each one honestly, rather than picking the most dramatic one and pretending it's inevitable, because that's the kind of intellectually lazy analysis I try very hard to avoid. The first path is functional capitulation dressed as compromise. Washington continues insisting publicly that mandatory tolls are illegal, while quietly accepting some version of the voluntary charges framing Oman has already floated, something structured to look like a maintenance and navigational safety fee rather than a sovereign toll, paid into some jointly administered fund, probably run primarily through Oman, since Oman has a far cleaner diplomatic profile than Iran and can absorb this arrangement without the same sanctions complications. This lets the United States save face rhetorically, while Iran achieves the substance of what it wants, a recurring revenue stream tied to strait access. I think this is currently the most likely outcome, precisely because it is the outcome that lets every party claim victory in its own domestic language, while nobody actually calls it what it is. The second path is prolonged stalemate. The 60-day negotiating window that both sides accepted in June was always going to be contentious on exactly this issue, and it's entirely possible neither side blinks before the clock runs out. In that scenario, you get exactly what we've already seen glimpses of: sporadic incidents like the ever-lovely drone strikes near vessels using non-Iranian approved routes, retaliatory American strikes on Iranian coastal positions, followed by de-escalation understandings that hold for a week or two before the next flashpoint. This is survivable for the global economy in the sense that catastrophic supply disruption doesn't happen, but it is genuinely bad for shipping costs, insurance premiums, and the psychological sense among ship owners that the strait is a known, stable, low-risk transit corridor. That confidence, once broken according to analysts who track this closely, does not simply come back because a piece of paper gets signed. Companies build in redundancy. They hedge. They route around when they can, even at higher cost, because the alternative is betting a multi-hundred-million-dollar vessel and its crew on the good faith of an arrangement that has already broken down twice this year. The third path, the one nobody in Washington wants to say out loud, but that deserves to be named anyway, is that this entire episode becomes a template, not just for Iran, but for every state sitting on a global choke point watching how this plays out. Egypt is watching, even though Suez is a different legal category. Turkey is watching, sitting on the Bosphorus. And further out, this is the piece that should genuinely worry American strategists thinking about the Pacific. China is watching too, taking very careful notes on precisely how much international outrage, how much enforcement capacity, and how much actual cost the United States was willing and able to absorb over a choke point fight in a region where it has spent decades building military infrastructure specifically to prevent this kind of thing from happening. If Iran, a state that just lost a war, can successfully monetize a strait it does not legally control, the lesson available to any state anywhere near the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait is not a subtle one. Let me bring this back to where I started, because I think the frame matters more than any individual fact I've given you tonight. This is not fundamentally a story about oil tankers and administrative fee schedules, even though that is the vocabulary everyone involved is using at the table. It is a story about what leverage actually is, once you strip away the military scoreboard. Iran lost the war in every sense the Pentagon would recognize as losing. Its nuclear program was set back. Its leadership was killed. Its economy remains under enormous strain. And none of it, has stopped it from sitting across the table from the world's most powerful country and negotiating the terms under which it gets paid, indefinitely, by the countries that beat it. That is not a contradiction. That is exactly what happens when you understand that the 21st century's most valuable strategic assets are not always armies or missiles. Sometimes they are simply coordinates on a map, 21 nautical miles wide, that everyone else has to cross whether they like it or not. Washington won the war. Whether Washington wins the peace depends entirely on whether it can find a way to say no to an invoice it has. So far, only found ways to quietly negotiate. Watch this space because the 60-day clock is still running, and whatever gets signed when it expires is going to tell you more about the actual balance of power in the Gulf than anything that happened on the battlefield this year.